Your ears are way more sensitive than you might have been led to believe. Some people will tell you that we can measure more than we can perceive, and sometimes that's true. In most cases though, that's wrong. And we need to understand a bit more about the human auditory system in order to explain why that is. Let's start with some quick biology before we make sense of how that biology impacts what we hear, what we perceive, and what we can measure. When sound enters the ear canal, it arrives at the eardrum and vibrates the eardrum. But you probably knew that bit already. Those vibrations are then amplified by a series of 3 bones that connect the eardrum to another membrane that's very much like the eardrum called the oval window. The oval window transfers the vibrations into the cochlea, or sometimes called the inner ear. And the cochlea is a long, rolled up tube consisting of a series of hair cells attached to a membrane and all floating in fluid. Across the length of that membrane, there are 3,500 sections of that membrane that will all resonate a little bit differently to different frequencies. And each of those sections will send nerve impulses up to the brain. And so that essentially means that the hair cells attached to that membrane are broken into specific frequency groups. Now, of course, there's a graduation between them. It's not clear cut. There's no physical separation of these, but they will respond differently to different frequencies, and that creates an entire frequency range of hearing. And we'll get to more detail on that very shortly. Keeping things simple for now though, when a complex waveform arrives at the cochlea, it's instantaneously broken down into its constituent frequencies by those groups of hair cells and the different vibrations of the membrane. That means that if you were to hear a clarinet playing a middle C note, which is 262 Hz, the hair cells on the membrane where it resonates at 262 Hz, those would activate. They'd send nerve impulses up to the brain. But there would also be activations of the 786 Hz hair cells and the 1110 Hz hair cells. And that's because those are the 2 additional harmonics that define the sound of a clarinet playing a middle C. The main note being played, or the fundamental frequency, is the 262 Hz middle C note, but the harmonics are a part of the natural resonance of the clarinet and define its sound because we're able to hear it and break it apart. And so that is already amazing. But we're far from done. Picking up the signals from those 3,500 sections of that membrane are 30,000 individual nerve fibers. And by having so many connections between the cochlea and the brain, our brains are able to pick up all sorts of information about pitch, loudness, and the timing of the signals. The way that information is then interpreted tells us much, much more. Before we break down how that information is processed in the brain, we actually need to talk a little bit about how it's processed within the cochlea. The cochlea is not just a passive system like a microphone or a guitar pickup. There's also an active amplification function within the cochlea that increases the sensitivity of our hearing apparatus to different frequencies, provides a greater dynamic range, and can even increase the sensitivity and resolution of our hearing systems. But it's not active all the time. It only activates when we hear an ongoing sound. It's also then able to adjust the levels of amplification and sensitivity tuning across 3 different stages. And this is where we start to get the first inklings of why translating measurements to perceptions is so tricky. Unlike measurement devices, our ears change to suit the input. We're not measuring for a static target. How we respond to a short sound or a single tone is different to how we respond to an ongoing sound like music, or a complex sound like music. I spoke in a previous video on a similar topic to this one about the fact that there are nerve fibers coming from the brain back out to the ears, as well as the fibers taking the signals from the ears up to the brain. Those nerve fibers coming back from the brain help us to focus our attention and better understand and investigate sounds we're particularly interested in. I suspect that those fibers have a lot to do with that amplification system, that active system in the cochlea I just spoke about, but neither that study nor the study I'm talking about here today specifically mention that. And speaking of studies, I should specify that everything I'm talking about in this video today comes from a peer-reviewed scientific meta-analysis of a whole lot of different studies. In plain English, that means that the author of this article has collated the findings of lots of other studies, 218 to be precise, and he's summarised all of the key findings from those articles to paint us a comprehensive picture of our incredible auditory systems. The paper I'm talking about was written by Milan Kunchur, I hope I'm saying that right, and at the time of writing, he was a Governor's Distinguished Professor at South Carolina University. He might still be, I haven't checked that out. I've linked that main study by Milan Kunchur in the description down below, so you can check it out and give it a full read if you want to, but do be warned, it's not light reading. And so to this point, what we know is that we have an outer auditory system, that being the outer ears and the inner ear, that's able to mechanically break down complex waveforms into its constituent frequencies. We also know that that system is an active system that's able to adjust its sensitivity and its frequency response and even its dynamic range as needed to suit the incoming signal. What I haven't yet mentioned is that those 30,000 nerve fibers I spoke about before, broken into those 3,500 kind of frequency groups, if you like, combine to make a system with incredible sensitivity. Even an auditory system that's diminished by age-related hearing loss can still resolve a detail level of 10 to the power of 32 units of resolution. To put that in perspective, think of auditory detail or details you hear a bit like pixels in video. An 8K screen has 33.2 million pixels. Even if you've lost some of your hearing capabilities due to age, you still have about this many pixels of sonic resolution. To put it another way, our auditory system is sensitive enough to detect vibrations in that membrane in the cochlea as small as 1 picometer. If you haven't heard that term before, it's not surprising. We don't use it in day-to-day life, and that's because 1 picometer is about 100 times smaller than the size of an atom. Think about that for a moment. Our ears are sensitive to a vibration that creates a movement that is 100 times smaller than the size of an atom. And that level of sensitivity applies across 3,500 different sections of the cochlear membrane. What that translates to is that we can accurately detect a shift in pitch or frequency of just 0.2%. And if you're a trained musician, that number can get even lower. That's also with only one ear. If we use both ears, our sensitivity gets even better because of what we call cross-channel processing. In other words, the brain is going to compare the information coming from both ears and work out even greater levels of detail as a result. And the result of all this is that humans can distinguish about 5,000 individual levels of pitch across the entire audible frequency range. But that's just pitch. If we now think about loudness, our ears have a dynamic range. That's the difference between the quietest and the loudest sound we can hear. That's around about 95 to 100 decibels. Decibels can be hard to fathom though because it's a very abstract term. So let's put that into some perspective. A good quality recording these days will have a dynamic range of about 30 decibels. And I'm not referring to compressed pop music designed for radio, Spotify, wireless speakers. I'm talking about a proper audiophile quality recording. If that's still too abstract for you, a 100 decibel sound is about 10 million times louder than a 30 decibel sound. You're probably starting to see a trend at this point. Our ears are incredibly sensitive and powerful tools that we often take for granted. It's easy enough to do because we don't have to think about how we hear. The sound just arrives and we perceive it all in our brains. But there's so much more going on. And yet, everything I've spoken about so far doesn't really make a difference when we start talking about measurements versus perception. Almost all modern audio gear and testing devices has sufficient sensitivity and capability to measure everything we need to know about frequency response, distortion characteristics, and dynamic range. Where things get a bit more complex is once we start to consider things like the timing and also the complex or complicated processing that our brains are doing with that sound. Our auditory systems, unsurprisingly, are also incredibly accurate when it comes to timing, down to an accuracy of about 1 microsecond or less. I know, another meaningless number. 1 microsecond is 1/1,000,000th of a second, and that becomes very important when we dive a bit deeper. But first, let me just tell you a little bit about how the brain processes the information that comes from the cochlea. We have a part of our brain that's dedicated just to hearing. It's in the temporal lobes, which are on the sides of our brain, up near our ears, funnily enough. But that's not the only part of our brains that's involved in hearing. When impulses come flying up those 30,000 nerve fibers from the cochleas, they're literally dispersed across the entire brain. From the primitive parts of the brain in the brain stem and the deep structures of the brain, through to the high level sections of the brain in the cortex. That's the wriggly bit that we think of when we see in diagrams and images. I'm not going to try and break this down because it would probably melt both of our brains, but this diagram shows all parts of the brain that are involved in processing what we hear. What's more, they don't work independently. Each part of the brain, each center in the brain, if you want to call it that, is constantly cross-referencing with all the other parts of the brain. And that helps to build an incredibly accurate and deeply nuanced understanding of what we're hearing. In other words, whilst our ears are collecting information about pitch, loudness, and the timing of the sound, our brains are working like a master painter to take each of those individual colours and turn it into an auditory image or a sonic image of the world. One relatively simple example of this is timbre. Timbre refers to the character of sound, not its pitch, not its loudness, but the thing that will separate one instrument from another even if they're both playing the same note. In other words, our brains don't just use pitch to understand which instrument is playing a particular note. This was proved by playing recordings of all different instruments to the musicians that play those instruments, but they trimmed off the very, very first microseconds of the sound. Those first fractions of a second contain what's called onset transients. And when the musicians heard the sounds of their instruments and other instruments they're deeply familiar with those onset transients removed, they couldn't tell which instrument was which. They had to choose what they thought it was from a range of options, but almost inevitably, they'd get it wrong. And this showed that our brains use the complex mixture of information at the beginning of a sound to determine its timbre. It's not just the mixture of the fundamental frequency and the harmonics that I mentioned before, because that was all still present in this test. The sustained notes contained all the harmonics, all the fundamental frequencies, it was just missing that transient at the beginning of the note. But even that is still just scratching the surface of why timing and that cross-processing of sound is so important to what we hear. Are you ready? Let's peel back this onion a bit more. Think about what a complex waveform looks like. This is a visual representation of a complex mixture of all different frequencies, all different waveforms, bundled together from a bunch of different instruments playing all at once. And yet, when we hear that waveform through our ears and all the processing that goes on in our brains, what we perceive is each individual instrument with a perfect understanding of its pitch, its loudness, its timing, and even its timbre and place in space. To paraphrase Daniel Levitin, the author of This Is Your Brain on Music, this is the equivalent to watching the movement of a trampoline like you were laying underneath the trampoline and you couldn't see above it. And there's a whole bunch of people jumping on the trampoline, all you can see is the movement of the trampoline's membrane. And yet you're able to work out who is jumping and exactly how high and when they're jumping and the way they're jumping. All of that is being done without ever seeing those people. How that's achieved is a remarkable combination of everything we've spoken about so far. Let's break down a few examples. Localization of sound or positioning of sound in space is one area that's particularly interesting. In other words, if you hear an instrument either live or through a recording but you can't physically see the instrument, how is it that you can know exactly where in space and what sort of space that instrument's in? It might be in a small bedroom or a large concert hall, and you'll still know how far away it is from you and how far away it is from the walls in the space that it's playing in. One way this is done is with reflected sounds bouncing off the walls, the ceiling and the floor, and even your own body. Depending on the height of the sound relative to us, their ranges of pitch will also be altered slightly. But that's only going to be helpful for complex sounds made up of multiple frequencies. In other words, the relative height of the sound to us could change how much of a particular harmonic we hear in a sound. And this is because the way our ears reflect sound, and now I'm talking about our physical pinna, the outside part of our ear, the way those reflect the sound changes depending on the height of the incoming sound. Different heights of sounds will increase or decrease the relative loudness of certain pitches as it comes into our ears. And our brain understands this. It combines that knowledge with everything else that our ears are reporting and makes sense of it. As an interesting side note, if you've listened to a bunch of different headphones, you might have experienced this for yourself. If you jump between two differently tuned headphones, sometimes you'll hear that certain sounds seem higher in the soundstage. And that's because our brains are being tricked by having a bit more of a certain frequency in the tuning of the headphone and thinking that it's actually a height cue caused by a high delivery of the sound. Something else that's going on with reflected sounds that's worth noting is that our brain is receiving information about every single reflection in the sonic environment. And that includes literally thousands of reflections for every single moment of complex sound like music. Cleverly though, our brain is able to integrate those reflections so it doesn't become overwhelming for us. Sounds within the first millisecond or so are integrated within the sound of that particular instrument. And then later reflections, as we start to approach, say, 5 milliseconds, those are used to understand the position of that sound or that instrument in space. And this is going on constantly throughout the entire piece of music. In other words, what I'm saying here is we don't consciously perceive each individual reflection, but we do perceive the result of how the brain interprets all of that data. One interesting example here is that our brains actually use the reflections coming off our shoulders to help us localize or position sound in space. But I'll bet that you've never consciously heard sound reflecting off your shoulders during a listening session. That's because our brain just seamlessly integrates it all. Of course, this opens another massive conversation around what is actually captured in a recording, where microphones are placed, and how all of that translates to the reproduction of music. But that's a whole different topic for a different video. Instead, let's just keep talking a little bit more about how we localize sounds in space. And we will shortly come back around to what all this means for measurements and even how to build a great audio system. Remember I spoke earlier about the importance of transients in defining an instrument's timbre? It turns out that that same cluster of information also helps us understand a sound's position in space. This is known as the Franzen effect and can be demonstrated through another interesting experiment. If researchers take a stereo pair of speakers and they start playing a note through the left speaker and then gradually and perfectly crossfade it into the right speaker, and then perfectly and gradually back to the left speaker before ending it in the left speaker, the listener will have perceived the sound throughout the entire process as only ever having come from the left speaker. And that's because the brain predominantly uses those onset transients and actually the offset transients, the final part of the note, to define and understand where that sound was in space. And this starts to lead us now to a very specific point about measurements and the perception of sound. To my knowledge, there's no measurement available, or at least no measurement regularly published, that represents a system or a component's timing accuracy on transients. If you have two systems with excellent frequency response characteristics and excellent distortion characteristics, which realistically is most modern devices these days, they can still perform and sound very different due to their timing accuracy. I'll come back soon and talk about the sorts of things that can cause problems with the timing accuracy of many modern devices in a moment, but we do need to get still just a little bit more clarity about the complexity that is our auditory system. However, because I think you've got the gist of this already, I'm going to move a bit faster now. Let me list for you all the different things that play a role in defining a sound's position in space according to our brains. One thing is our brains know that if an instrument is 6 decibels louder than a similar instrument, it's probably twice as far away from us. To get even more accurate with that sense of distance, our brains also measure the ratio of the difference between the direct sound coming from the instrument with its reflected sounds. In other words, it works out just how much quieter the reflected sounds are compared to the direct sounds. We're also constantly monitoring for the differences between the higher frequencies and lower frequency sounds, because more energy or volume in the higher frequencies generally means the sound is closer to us. We're also constantly measuring the difference between when the sound arrives at one ear and the other, and the time it takes for the first reflections of a sound to reach us, combined with what the frequency characteristics are of those reflections. Let's think about that last one for a second. Our brains are separately processing the initial reflected sounds of an instrument for both their timing and their frequency characteristics, whilst also comparing them to the characteristics of the direct sound from the instrument. All of that happens in a matter of millionths of a second for every single sound you hear. It's mind-boggling, isn't it? All of that is going on constantly in our brains, as well as being scaled up and scaled down as we need when we need. You're probably starting to see why it's so hard to know what to measure for and how to predict what those measurements tell us about perception. After all, how do we measure a device's ability to accurately reproduce the transients of the instrument as well as the reproduction of all those tiny reflected sounds that it's needing to deliver, let alone the tiny levels of resolution required to get the detail needed from all those reflected sounds? This was actually something I noticed when I reviewed the insanely responsive Headphone 2 headphones. Back in that review, I commented on the fact that I could hear more of the room from the Headphone 2 than from just about any other headphone I've tried. And that's including really expensive flagship headphones. What I now understand, or at least I theorize, is that the Headphone 2, with its incredible speed, is able to deliver the resolution and the responsiveness to deliver all of those tiny reflected signals that are picked up in the recording, but to deliver them accurately enough for my brain to properly understand it. But even that is still only one aspect of sound quality, and I think that's starting to illustrate the point. Sound and music in particular, are incredibly complex. It's more than it just being a subjective hobby, but it is that as well. Each device in our system will be influencing the timing and the resolution of the sounds that we're hearing. By the time our brains process and cross-process all that information, the permutations of even one tiny difference from one system to the next can be striking. I'll wrap things up now with a few comments on what all this means. Consider two systems that measure identically and measure extremely well by recognised measurement protocols. Let's imagine that System A is actually close to perfect in every possible way, even going beyond measurements. And let's imagine that in System B, there's a bit of an issue with capacitance. That means that somewhere in the system there is a part of the system that's holding onto the signal for a little bit longer than it should and releasing it more gradually. That's what capacitance is. It's the tendency to hold onto that energy. And so in System B, an impulse that should last for say 2 microseconds might be stretched out over 4 to 5 microseconds. System B though will still have a perfect frequency response. It will still have incredible distortion characteristics because it's not changing the frequency characteristics of the sound. It's just holding on to them for a little bit longer. But think back now to how accurate our ears are with timing and how important timing is both to the timbre of the sound and the sound staging and imaging of the sound. Imagine then what System B is doing with its excess capacitance and the influence of that on the sound that we hear. System B will produce a sound with noticeably poorer timbral accuracy and spatial accuracy. It will be less lifelike and likely less enjoyable, but it will measure identically to System A. Let's take it a step further. Something I held back before to prevent information overload is that if two sounds arrive at the ear at approximately the same time, and remember we're talking microseconds here, and if they're at similar frequencies, the louder sound will mask the quieter sound. That means that we won't hear the quieter sound, we'll only hear the louder one. Now, let's go back to our System A and B example. If System B with its excess capacitance somewhere in the system is stretching out signals for longer than they should, and therefore they're still there when they should have disappeared, those unwanted stretched signals will be masking other tiny detail signals. Now, before you say that those signals are irrelevant because we wouldn't hear them anyway, remember that our hearing capabilities are 10 million times larger than what's in a recording. Remember also that our hearing systems have resolution of 10 to the power of 32 levels of detail, and that's after they've lost a bunch from age-related hearing loss. If the sound is in the recording, we will hear it, as long as there's nothing masking it. And so in System A, we will hear those extra details. In System B, we won't because they're being masked by those stretched out signals caused by the capacitance. On System A, we'll enjoy a remarkable sense of space and image accuracy. Not so much on System B, but both systems will measure identically by regular recognised measurement protocols. So, would you like to know what will damage the accuracy of your system's sound? In other words, would you like to know how to get better sound? Firstly, the speed of components like transistors in the analog stage of your DAC, in your preamp, your amp, or your headphone amp all matter. They're also very rarely talked about or measured, and so that's where auditions and reviews are so important. Next, the responsiveness of the drivers, whether it's in headphones or speakers, does also matter, and it won't show up in a frequency response graph, even in headphones. How rapidly a driver can start, stop, and change direction will have an impact on the accuracy of the timing of those tiny signals and whether they're reproduced at all. And here, we get to the really contentious part. Cables. You see, every single cable on the planet has a combination of resistance, inductance, and, you guessed it, capacitance. If the cable is holding onto the signal and releasing it more slowly, it's smearing the timing of sounds and potentially masking some of the quieter sounds. This won't show up in frequency response measurements because it's a timing thing. It has been electronically measured in one of the studies cited within this meta-analysis, and you can see with this graph that the signal in cable G is held significantly longer than the exact same signal in cable S. That's a difference of a couple of microseconds, and we already know that the sensitivity of our hearing system goes beyond a couple of microseconds. What's more, it will matter for every single aspect of the sound and our perception of the sound, except for frequency response, harmonic distortion, and noise. That means it will affect timbre, imaging accuracy, fine detail resolution, overall soundstage size, and the sense of separation of each individual instrument. Want to go one layer deeper? I know I said this was a summary, but it's a complex topic. If noise is entering the digital end of your system and influencing the timing circuit of your DAC or your streamer or your transport, whatever it might be, that could be causing additional jitter. And jitter is a word used to describe timing errors. Based on the fact that we have sensitivity of our hearing down to 1/1,000,000th of a second, even tiny errors in timing will make a difference to what we hear. And this is why accessories such as cables, power supplies or filters can make a difference to the sound of a system. Basically anything that's able to reduce the noise entering the system can improve its sound. That's assuming the system doesn't have a bigger problem that's larger than the impact of removing some noise. So now it's time for one final degrader of sound quality before we bring this epic adventure to a close. The other thing that can smear timing and damage the quality of what you hear are feedback circuits. I'm not saying that all feedback circuits are bad, and the meta-analysis doesn't go into specific details about which feedback circuits are or are not good, and there are many different types of feedback. But what we do know is that feedback circuits work by looping the signal back around onto itself to cancel out noise. And that simple process of looping a signal back on itself, by its nature, has to introduce some smearing of time, depending on how fast the circuit is and how many of them are layered together. And I believe that's why I tend to not always enjoy the products from brands that are very measurement focused, brands like SMSL and Topping and FIO that use these systems to get better measurements. However, I do find some of their products very enjoyable. And so that's why I'm not suggesting that all feedback is bad, but it is something to consider. And again, it's where reviews and auditions can be very helpful. So let's properly summarize and close this off now with a few important truths. Firstly, what we hear depends on the level, the structure or content you could call it, and the history of the audio signal. The tone-based or sinus wave signals used for most testing can't capture that. Another point is that because timing is so important and our hearing systems are so complex, measurements such as frequency response, harmonic distortion, and intermodulation distortion can't consistently predict the perceived sound quality of a system, and they may actually negatively predict the sound quality of a system. That's according to a study by FE Tool. It'll be in the citations of the article linked below. Carrying on from that, anything, and I mean anything in your system that is restricting the agility of the system and its timing accuracy will be degrading the perceived quality of the sound you're hearing, even if it has no impact on the frequency response or the distortion characteristics of your system. And then the final point, and quite an exciting one, is that because hearing happens in all parts of the brain, including the higher level ones in our cortex, we can actually learn and practice to become better listeners and hear more. Watch this video next if you want to know how. For now, I've probably melted your brains enough, so thank you to YouTube channel members, thank you to channel Patreon members, and thank you to those of you that leave super thanks on videos like this one. And until next time, happy listening, be kind to each other, and I'll see you again soon on Passion for Sound.